Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Pilato, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the CEO of MassEdCo. For those of you who don't know us, MassEdCo is the Commonwealth's largest provider of community-based education and career readiness services for low-income, first-generation, underrepresented, and marginalized youth and adults. We serve about 12,000 individuals throughout the state. We are presenting today on a rather timely topic, student loans, borrowing, repaying, and forgiving. We have a phenomenal group of folks who are going to be sharing their expertise and advice with you. I would like to, at this point, introduce Julie Shields-Rutyna, who, as our financial sponsor at MEFA, brings her own expertise to the table. Julie, welcome.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone. Yes, so I'm Julie Shields-Rutyna, and I'm the Director of College Planning, Education, and Training at MEFA. And we're so happy that you're with us this morning. Hopefully you're safe and dry, and at least we know you have internet if you're here with us. So we have a very important topic to discuss this morning, and we're fortunate to have a nationally recognized expert in Betsy Mayotte to speak with us about this. I'll introduce Betsy in one moment, but I'll let you know a little bit about the structure of the morning. Betsy is going to talk with us about all things loans, especially where we are with borrowing, repaying, and forgiving. And then we have a panel of experts who are going to respond to all of these topics. And you'll get to hear from them as well. And I'll introduce them before the panel begins. We do want to answer your questions and take some questions. So put your questions into the question and answer section. Although we'll probably wait until the end to get to those questions, just because we have a full agenda and we want to make sure we get through everything in the next hour and a half. And we are recording this, so there will be a recording for those who might need to leave early or something like that. So with that, let me introduce Betsy. Betsy Mayotte is the president and founder of the Institute of Student Loan Advisors, better known as TISLA. She has been working in the student loan industry, doing compliance and advocacy work for over 20 years. And has helped thousands of borrowers with their student loans. Betsy has served as a primary negotiator for several Title IV negotiated rulemaking sessions on topics such as the use of student loans at foreign schools, loan rehabilitation, and borrower defense to repayment. In addition, Betsy frequently conducts regulatory trainings for the higher education financing industry, both in the United States and abroad. She is regularly quoted in the media on student loan issues, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. So thank you, Betsy. Welcome.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. I hope everyone's has battened down their perspective hatches in the spirit of tell me you're from New England without telling me from New England. The #1 post on my town's Facebook page this morning was someone asking if there were any Dunkin' Donuts open. So I hope everyone has power and at least was able to get coffee. I'm going to do you all a favor and I'm going to get my face off of this for now. Okay, so my goal here today is to sort of draw the landscape of where we're at right now from a borrowing student loans, repaying student loans, and forgiving student loans. I'm presenting you with a lot of data, and you're going to be, the purpose of all this data is just sort of so you have it. So I believe that Mark will be sending out these slides after the presentation, so don't fret about writing down all the data, but I'm sort of using it as a background for what I'm going to be talking about. So diving right in, let's talk about money. So, I guess I want to start off by giving sort of an umbrella statement to the whole student loan situation. And I just want to remind people that student loans aren't actually the problem. Student loans are the symptom of the problem. The problem is the cost of higher education. So all of these issues that I'm talking about and proposals that I'm mentioning that could help ameliorate the student loan crisis, they're all important, but we're not really going to fix the student loan crisis until we fix the way we pay for education and the cost of higher education. So I just sort of want to stick that premise over everything that we're going to be talking about today. So, the first piece of data I wanted to share with you, for those of you unaware, is how much are people allowed to borrow? Now, the vast majority of people that do borrow under the federal student loan programs. And what you have in front of you are the annual and aggregate limits that are allowed under the federal student loan program. Now, one thing I want to point out is that there is no limit for Parent Plus loans and Graduate Plus loans. Those borrowers can borrow up to the cost of attendance minus any other aid. So when you're seeing six-figure debts, chances are that it's either there's Parent Plus debt in there, or there's graduate program debt in there. And the fact of the matter is, when people talk about the student debt crisis, they're always talking about the six figures. And as you'll see as we move forward, the borrowers with the six figures in debt, first of all, they're a very, very small percentage of the portfolio, but also they're not the ones that tend to struggle. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. As far as average student debt, what you're seeing in front of you now is, excuse me, the average student debt by constituency. So the average debt for a bachelor's degree is around $29,000. Dental school debt is close to $300,000. Veterinary school debt is $183,000. Just as an aside, one of the sort of quiet, struggling constituencies when you talk about student debt is actually veterinarians. Veterinarians, as you can see, take on almost as much debt as people doctors do, yet they tend not to work for organizations where they can be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. There is a very high burnout and actually suicide rate amongst veterinarians, and part of it is related to the amount of debt they have to take on. The other thing is they don't get paid nearly as much on average as people doctors do. The average salary for a veterinarian is only in the $70,000 range. So might be sort of something that we weren't aware of, and we don't hear a lot of talk about veterinarians when we talk about different constituencies that are struggling. Now, the overall average student loan debt on a national average as of 2020 is just under $33,000. So the total federal student loan debt, we're at about $1.5 trillion. If you loop in the private student loans, we get up to $1.7 trillion. The amount of student loan debt in the United States has exceeded credit card debt for years now and continues to exceed credit card debt. The number of student loan borrowers is just under 45 million. That includes private student loan borrowers. Massachusetts borrowers owe an average of 33 and change, which is slightly higher than the national average. Connecticut actually has the highest per borrower student loan debt is $39,000. Massachusetts ranks 9th in average student loan debt per borrower. Now, one thing to mention is that student loan debt, one of the policy education points that we need to work on is who the student loan borrower is. People still think that when they think student loan borrower, they're thinking of a 22-year-old or 23-year-old. The fact of the matter is that half of all borrowers are over the age of 30, a quarter are over the age of 45, and the fastest growing population of U.S. citizens that carry student loan debt are the over 65s. In fact, student loan debt for borrowers 60 and over has increased by almost 1,300% since 2004. And if you when you're thinking about student loan debt and you're assuming that your student loan borrower is under 25, you're assuming that they have most of their career years in front of them to pay that debt off. But when you are rethinking it, that half of a quarter are over 45 and the fastest growing population the over 60s and 65s, you've completely changed that paradigm as far as of what's considered affordable debt for the average student loan borrower. And just to sort of talk more about what the reality is of the age of the student loan borrower, you can see that the change in student loan just over 1 year, from 2019 to 2020. And as you can see, looking at the average student loan debt, the numbers get much higher once you get to Generation X, the baby boomers, and what in this particular chart from Experian, they're calling the silent generation. In this case, they're looking at the over 75s. 40% of borrowers are over 25 years old. The share of older households with home, credit card, and student loan debt was significantly higher in 2016 than it was in 1989. And budget estimates show that almost 1 million new Parent Plus borrowers, we get 1 million more Parent Plus borrowers, which again tend to be the older borrowers, on an annual basis. The lifetime default rates for Parent Plus borrowers are about 10%. So again, these older borrowers, if you go, I don't think I put the data in this presentation, but if you go over and look at the New York Fed's website, they've done a really good job of breaking the data down by age, and also breaking it down by age on who struggles. The Department of Education also has similar data, and I believe I have a link to that in the resources page. But not only are these older borrowers the fastest growing population holding student loan debt, they're also the ones that struggle the most. They have the highest percentage of loans that are over 90 days delinquent or in default. And again, their lifetime default rates are almost at the 10% range. Now that we've sort of set the stage of what the student loan borrower looks like and how much we're talking about, let's talk about why we're there. Now, there is a strange phenomenon when it comes to student loan debt as opposed to other types of consumer debt. People that will make ROI and otherwise rational decisions about how much debt they're going to take on when they buy their house, when they buy a car, when they utilize their credit cards or make other large purchases, they tend to not make the decision tree is not the same when it comes to college debt. College debt and the choosing of college and the choosing of taking on college debt is a much more emotional decision than a practical decision. And that's one of the things that we need to start changing when we're doing our counseling. We need to get families to start, and I got to admit, what I'm about to say makes me very sad, but unfortunately it's the reality. The days of education for education's sake are gone. Families need to be looking at return on investment when you're looking at how the cost of college, how much you're willing to go into debt for it. And families just aren't there yet for the most part. And this is the example I like to use. This car in front of you is a real car. It's called the Caterham 620R. It is terrible in the snow and the ice. It doesn't do well on speed bumps. It does come with its own fire extinguisher, though, from a safety perspective. This car costs $90,000 if you want it to come fully assembled. If you're willing to put it together yourself, they drop it down to the bargain price of $72,000. Now, in just about any household in America, if the child came in and said, but mom, but dad, it's my dream car, mom or dad, or mom and dad would laugh at them. There would be no concept of getting this car for the child. And the reason being is it's not practical. It is unlikely to suit the child's needs. And it's unlikely to be, the cost is is likely not affordable. So the return on it doesn't fit their needs, and the return on investment isn't there. But then when you have that same discussion about college, and college X, it's $50,000 per year. The average debt is $90,000. The student says their friends are going there, or the dorms are awesome. The student may or may not know what they want to study, but if the student says, "Mom, it's my dream school," then the parents are going to bend over backwards in a lot of cases and not worry and not be as cognizant about the affordability of the debt they take on in order to make sure that that student attends that school. And in fact, the school might not meet the student's needs, and it may not be practical, and of course, it may not be affordable. So again, even though I think this is very sad, and to be clear, I fully support and think that college choice and access is very important, but that access should be based on whether that institution and the programs that they offer fits the student's needs and fits the family's affordability. Excuse me. What you have in front of you are the top 10 reasons why students choose a particular college. And as you can see, there's a lot of these are emotional choices rather than practical choices. I was offered financial assistance. I visited the campus is number 5. They have a good reputation for their social activities. I wanted to go to a school of about that size. One could argue that the size of the college is relevant to the student's practical needs, but not always. The percentage of students that graduate, now that is a practical aspect to it. I wanted to live near home. Again, that can be practical, but it also can be emotional. As I've been alluding to, what we need to do is, and this is part of overall financial literacy, try to get families to look at college as a rational purchase, like they would a vehicle or a home, versus an emotional purchase. We want them looking at profit, security, utility, caution, and health, as opposed to envy or entertainment or sentiment. And here's a big reason why. 75% of students that enter a 4-year institution change their majors. And because of that, half of those students end up, when they transfer majors or they transfer institutions, and as you can see, almost 40% also change institutions, they end up losing credits. And what that leads to is the average time to earn a diploma, which the average time to gain a 4-year degree is actually 5.5 years. And only 2 out of 5 students are going to do this in 6 years. So what that leads to is increased cost. So even families that are trying to estimate the cost over 4 years, they're more than likely underestimating, because they're assuming the student's going to complete in 4, when in fact it's a higher likelihood it's going to be closer to 5 or 5.5. And then 31 million students who started college in the last 20 years dropped out and never received a credential. And those are the borrowers that struggle. It's not the $100,000 borrowers. It's the $10,000 and under borrowers, because the $100,000 borrowers likely receive their credential and then some, probably a graduate credential or professional credential as well. Whereas the borrowers that owe less than 10 grand, they have debt and no degree. And as you'll see as we move on, those are the borrowers that have a much, much higher likelihood of defaulting. So it's time for us to change the focus. If you consider the high rate of major changes and institution changes, we want families to be looking at things like school retention rates, which is the percentage of students that make it from year 1 to year 2. The graduation rate. If you're looking at a school whose default rate is higher than their graduation rate, even if it is close to home and the right size and they have the major, that's a warning sign. And many families aren't looking at those pieces of data at all. What's the average debt? What's the repayment rate? Now, repayment rate is the percentage of borrowers whose balance on their student loans is lower at the end of the year than it was at the beginning of the year. and of course the default rate. In other words, we want families, instead of to be looking at, again, majors and size of school and sports facilities and so on, which are more emotional, we want them looking at outcomes to make that decision. Again, some people get frustrated with me when I compare higher education to a car, and I know they are very, very different, but they're also very much the same. Things you look at when you buy a car are the reliability of the car and the total cost over time and so on. Those are all rational versus emotional decision points. There's the other issue, one of the other issues here that leads to unaffordable student debt is the lack of financial literacy. 69, this data amazed me when I first researched it and continues to amaze me every time I go back to it. 69% of parents are reluctant to discuss money with their children. 30% of them would rather talk to their kids about sex than they would talk to them about finances. In the United States, we rank 7th out of 15 countries in financial literacy. In a study in 2014, only 24% of millennials could get 4 out of 5 questions on a financial literacy quiz correct. Now, if you track that to credit scores and default rates on student loans, students that enjoyed mandatory financial literacy training in high school tended to have much higher credit scores and had a much less likelihood of default. Now, if you think about it, the fact that we don't offer mandatory financial literacy in all institutions is nuts. That would be the same as allowing students to drive a car without putting them through driver's education. We're not giving many students financial literacy education at home or at school, but we're putting in front of them very easy to get student loan money without giving them the tools to actively and successfully manage or drive that student loan debt once they take it on. So that's something else that is one of the reasons, in my opinion, that the student debt crisis is what it is. The other thing is when there is financial counseling, it tends to be cookie cutter, and it can't be. You need to know your audience. For example, lower income families tend to have higher financial literacy. So for them, you want to focus on predatory, like they know how to make it. Lower income families know what a budget is and know how to make a budget and understand the impact of having an extra payment is going to mean on that budget in the long term. What they need help with is predatory lending practices, banking practices, saving and investment strategies, the use of credit and interest rates. Whereas middle and higher income children tend to receive less guidance. They don't know how to make a budget. They don't understand how interest accrues or debt gets repaid. And they also need help with investment and retirement. The final sort of big box that I want to check that, in my opinion, is what has led to the student debt crisis that we're in, is the way the student debt is awarded. For one thing, one of the biggest mistakes I think they ever made was back in 2000 when they created what's called the master promissory note. So borrowers don't have to sign a promissory note with the amount on it every year. They just have to, and in some cases, they don't even have to sign an award letter. So they sign that promissory note the first year. Then in subsequent years, they just get an award letter that, as you'll see in a minute, may or may not be clear as to how much is free money versus money they have to repay. And the school has what we call a passive award letter process, meaning if the student does nothing, then the loan comes in. So in my work at TISLA, I hear all the time from borrowers that had no idea what they borrowed. And those are the reasons for it. Now, if you look at the award letters, the other thing we desperately need to do, and the schools fight me on this all the time, is we need to have a standard award letter. No award letter looks the same. They all use different jargon and terminology. A lot of them omit the actual costs, and a lot of them fail to differentiate the types of aid, especially with first generation families. What we hear is that they didn't because the Parent Plus loan or the Stafford loans were all bunched up with everything else, and it just says Parent Plus or it just says Stafford, they don't realize that that's money that has to be repaid. 15% of letters, in fact, list Parent Plus as an award, which makes the financial aid package look a lot more generous than it really is. Only 40% of the award letters that were in this particular study, which I've given you the link to that study if you want to take a deeper dive into it, which it's really kind of fascinating to see. Only 40% of those letters even calculate what the student would need to pay. And of almost 200 institutions, they had 23 different ways of calculating it. So even if families are trying to compare potential debt or potential cost of college, they can't even, they're looking at apples and oranges when they're trying to compare these award letters. Here's an amazing example. Of the 194 award letters that were looked at in this New America study, they had 136 different ways to list the federal direct unsubsidized loan. And we wonder why consumers get confused. Overall, effective counseling is about providing the right information at the right time. And yes, borrowers get entrance and exit counseling, but they're at the worst possible time. Entrance counseling is what educates borrowers about the terms of their loans. These days, it actually might give them an estimated total amount that they will owe in debt. But by the time they get this entrance counseling, they've already moved into their dorms and put their REM posters on the wall, which I know I just dated myself by saying that. No, there's nobody that is going to change their decision at the point that they're getting entrance counseling. I've proposed numerous times that they actually move entrance counseling to the FAFSA process. So they're actually getting the information about the loans before they make the college decision and take out the loans. The other issue is the way we present it. I don't care how financially savvy you are. Our little lizard brains just can't wrap their heads around the large amounts of money versus the payment. So I would like to see more counseling include not just how much you're going to owe, but what that translates to in a monthly payment. So, I was lucky enough to grow up with heavy financial literacy in my home. My father was president of a credit union. But even, if I see I'm going to owe 80 grand, I know that's a big number, but that doesn't mean as much to me as that's going to cost you $1,000 a month every month for 120 months. So we need to see debt presented in edible way, in a more of an edible way. Okay, so we just talked about borrowing. Let's talk about repayment. And I've organized this as where we've been, where we are, where we're going, especially in relation to the COVID waivers. So prior to the pandemic, because we're in a really interesting time right now because of these COVID waivers, I sort of can't wait to see what transpires, but I'm also a little, or more than a little, concerned about where we're going to end up. So as of December of 2019, including private loans, we were at 1.7 trillion in student loan debt. We had 45 million borrowers, but 1.5 of that was federal debt. Now, this is what troubles me. Prior to the pandemic, only 36% of federal student loan borrowers were in active repayment and not delinquent on their loans. And by not delinquent, I mean under 31 days past due. So less than 40% were actually in repayment. If you look, there was an enormous percentage that was either in deferment or forbearance. There was about a third were in an in-school or grace period. I'm not as much worried about them. Over 20% were in default. And if you add the borrowers that were over 31 days delinquent, again, you're looking at about a third of borrowers. And that was before the pandemic started. If you look at default, I mean, what we tend to see for default is we only see the national default rate. And that's, in my opinion, it's a garbage number. It only looks at borrowers that default within the first 3 years after they leave school. And if you consider the fact that it takes over a year to default in the first place, you'll see why I don't think that number holds a lot of water. Prior to the pandemic, we had about 9.4 million borrowers that were in a default status. About 1 million borrowers, or a little more than 1 million, enter default on an annual basis. Many borrowers default multiple times. If we even looked at the 5-year default rate rather than the 3-year default rate, it jumps up to almost 20%. 25% of borrowers will default within their first 5 years of repayment. Some of them recover, so they don't end up in this, which is why the 5-year default rate is under 20%, when in fact 25% of borrowers actually do default in their first 5 years of repayment. I started to allude to this a minute ago, but the people that default might surprise you. Again, it tends not to be the borrowers with 6 figures of debt, tends to be the borrowers with lower amounts of debt. And again, that's because they tend to have debt with no degree. Now, if we were going to focus our counseling on the most at risk, these are the borrowers we want to focus on. The non-completers, the borrowers with low GPAs, because they tend to translate into non-completers, borrowers with the most Pell. And the reason for that is a big reason that people don't complete is financial. And Pell is, of course, for lower income students, which they're the ones that tend to have financial struggles that prevent them from completing their credential. Men default more than women. Borrowers that struggle with math default more than those that don't. So we have data, especially colleges and universities have data that they can use where it's not practical to do a deep dive on every family to see who's the most at risk and where to target your counseling, but they do have data to look at the broader groups to see where you might want to focus additional counseling. If we look at, and I mentioned this before, if we look at delinquency by age, you'll see the older the borrower, the higher the tendency of a 90-day delinquency or more. Getting back to counseling, exit counseling is also done at a terrible time. Exit counseling, if the borrower ends up getting it at all, it's when they have a lot of other priorities. They're trying to graduate, they're trying to do finals, they're trying to figure out where they're going to live or where they're going to work once they are out of school, and it's just not retained. 40% of students don't even remember ever getting exit counseling in the first place. A third of them had no idea what their interest rate was or even their loan term. 40% of borrowers go to social media for student loan advice. If those of you familiar with Reddit, if you go to the student loan sub, you'll know why I started TISLA in the first place. The amount of people that go to internet strangers where they don't even know their credentials to ask these really important student loan questions is phenomenal. My proposal for exit counseling is that they actually move it to 45 days before the borrower's first payment due and give them a 1/4 point discount on their interest rate as an incentive to go through it. All right, so where we're at now with the COVID wave, so that's where we were at prior to COVID. Where we're at now with the COVID waivers is about 85% of federal student loan borrowers haven't had to make a payment since March of 2020. They've also enjoyed a 0% interest rate. As an aside, this waiver period actually counts as a payment for those borrowers that are pursuing public service loan forgiveness or forgiveness under the income-driven plans. And what's even more phenomenal is that their credit reports are reflecting that they're actually in repayment and on time, even though they actually haven't had to make a payment. But come January of 2022, not to be dramatic about it, but we have a tsunami coming. We've got 42 million people entering repayment at the same time. And if you remember, prior to the pandemic, almost 4 million of them were at least 31 days past due prior to the pandemic, which is an indicator that they were struggling before. And the way the economy hasn't 100% recovered, chances are even more of them are struggling now. My fear is that, and the servicers and the Department of Education are working hard to try to ameliorate this. But the fact of the matter is, you just can't staff for this. So I am predicting much longer wait times on the phone. We're already seeing it as a result of the PSLF waivers, and a much longer processing time for paperwork. And borrowers just not being able, more borrowers in need of help and just not able to get in touch with anyone. You know, 13% of these borrowers will have moved and maybe not remembered to update their contact information, so they won't even get the notices that their payments are due. The confusion when the waivers were applied in the first place was enormous. Our inbox was very busy for 6 or 8 months after the waivers were put in place. That's how long it took people to really get an idea to understand them. And once the waivers come off, I think we're going to have those same phenomenon. Back in December, surveys showed that only 21% of people back in December felt ready to resume repayment, and 55% weren't sure they could pay on time consistently once the waivers were lifted. 65% of borrowers have no idea what their payment's going to be come February, and 2/3 of them don't know how to change their payment plan if needed. So we need to be doing an enormous communications campaign with borrowers, and it needs to be starting now to get them ready for once the waivers are lifted. Now, the options for relief, there's multiple repayment plans. Some are based on the borrower's balance, some are based on their income, and then of course there's also deferments and forbearances available. So about a year ago, here's how people planned what to do once their payments resumed. And unfortunately, there's a very high number that had planned on forbearance, which most of you know usually isn't a solution other than to prevent default. Forbearance is going to likely increase the borrower's balance and therefore give them an even higher payment once the forbearance is over. So again, we need to be working with borrowers to try to get them on a repayment plan that at least might supply some subsidies, even if the payment is less than the interest that's accruing. Now, I am expecting the Department of Ed, they're talking about some additional waivers to try to ease people back into repayment. Some of the chatter I've heard is maybe holding off on reporting delinquent loans to credit bureaus, holding off on new defaults, staggering when people are due to recertify their income-driven plans. They are, of course, doing some intensive outreach. How they're going to handle direct debit resumption payments remains to be seen. That one is really tricky. Some borrowers might just expect it to happen automatically. Some borrowers might not and end up with an overdrawn account. So that's a no-win situation. I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer here by any means. I'm just trying to educate you so you can help and do your part to prepare your constituents. Now, forgiveness. So I was hoping to I only have about 5 minutes left. I was hoping to have a little bit more time, especially because of the waivers, but I'm happy to hang out after to talk more about the waivers if you'd like. And also, I am doing a webinar just about PSLF and the waivers with the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And so I guess I'll do a shameless plug for that. If we don't get to as much of the PSLF stuff as you hoped, that webinar is on November 4th. It's free, and you can find information on it on my social media as well as the CFPB's website and social media. So there's essentially 3 buckets of forgiveness programs. There's the PSLF and other federal programs like teacher loan forgiveness and so on. There's the forgiveness that happens after 20 or 25 years under the income-driven plans. And then there's actually over 100 other federal and non-federal programs. We actually have a database on our website that keeps track of the forgiveness programs we know of. There's there's over 100 state-based programs. Most of them are based on profession, but there are some sort of quirky ones, such as in Kansas, the state of Kansas will repay $7 grand of your student loans, and all you have to do is move there. So there are a lot of forgiveness programs out there. The most well-known, of course, is public service loan forgiveness, which at a high level, the way to qualify for PSLF is you have to make 120 eligible payments, which generally means a payment made under an income-driven plan on an eligible loan, which is a direct loan, while working for an eligible employer, which is in general either a government employer or a 501c3. There are some other nonprofits that also count. So, and all these things have to happen at the same time. So you have to make the eligible payment on the eligible loan while you're working for the eligible employer to count. Unfortunately, this program has to some extent been fraught with peril, partly due to poor communication and education when it was first written into law, partly due to operational concerns. So to address that, the current administration on October 6th announced some pretty amazing but temporary waivers for a lot of the PSLF rules. They have the authority to do that under the HEROES Act, which is why this is temporary. But basically what they're doing is all the rules about eligible payment, with the exception of the fact that you still have to be working for an eligible employer and have a direct loan, are out the window. The Department of Ed is going back and looking at all the months that you were actually in a repayment status, and any of those months where you were working full-time for eligible employment, they're going to count them, even if it was on a FEL loan or a Perkins loan, even if it was prior to consolidation. Unfortunately, like much of the relief that is offered to student loan borrowers, they excluded the majority of Parent Plus borrowers. Parent Plus borrowers also aren't eligible for the majority of lower payment options. So again, this is another reason that we're seeing these older borrowers struggle. I am nagging the Department of Ed to ask them why they didn't include the Parent Plus. We'll see if I'm successful, but it's unfortunate and I'm still salty about it, in case you haven't noticed. These reviews are going to be done automatically. It's going to be done in a two-phased approach. The second phase won't likely be done until February or March. But we could see people getting forgiveness as early as next week, or maybe even the end of this week under these waivers, which is really amazing. In order to take advantage of these waivers, if you don't already have direct loans, you need to consolidate prior to October of 2022 and submit at least one proof of eligible employment also prior to October of 2022. You don't need to have reached 120 payments by October of 2022. You just have to hit those other two check boxes. And if it turns out that with the waivers, you have more than 120 eligible payments, you're probably going to get a refund. The only exception to that is if the payments you made over 120 were made prior to consolidation. I know this is a lot and I had to fast forward through it, but if you go to our website, we have it written up extensively, and we also have like a 10-page FAQ document that can help with that. A couple other things. Under this waiver, usually consolidating resets your PSLF count. It does not during this temporary waiver. If you have loans that have different counts, so you have some loans that have 33 eligible PSLF payments, you have another that has 50. If you consolidate, the consolidation loan is going to get the higher count. And just as an aside, and you don't need to answer this, am I the only one who didn't remember that the count had facial hair? Is that a new thing? Because I don't remember the count in my Sesame Street days having facial hair. So I'm just going to plant that seed. And then in my last 37 seconds, I have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is broad student loan forgiveness. Is Biden going to forgive all student loans? And while I'm not really good at reading tea leaves, my opinion is the chances of that are slim to none. And to be fair, Biden has not changed his narrative on this. Biden has said even during his campaign that he supports it, but it's Congress that has to do it, that he doesn't have the authority to do it. And frankly, I don't see Congress, even this Congress, having the appetite for broad student loan forgiveness unless we fix what's causing the loans to accrue in the first place. And I go back to what I said in my first minute, which is the issue is not student loans. The issue is the cost of higher ed. And unless we solve that and do something to prevent the loans from just accruing all over again, I just don't see Congress, even many Democrats, agreeing that that's a good use of taxpayer funding. Now, I had some hopes of even like a $10,000 forgiveness, a very small hope, to be fair, when I saw America's College Promise, which would have created free community college and perhaps tuition-free four-year university, but it appears that that is not going to make the final cut. So unless we see proposals like that actually making it through into law and addressing what's causing the debt to accrue in the first place, re-incentivizing states to reinvest in higher ed, which lowers the cost of public education, I would not count on anything other than these small targeted programs that the Department of Ed has done with the more vulnerable borrowers, such as with total and permanent disability discharge, this thing with PSLF, and the discharge for students that were defrauded by their schools. And with that, in your handout, you're going to get all kinds of links to the data I used. And now I'm going to be quiet and look forward to hearing my panelists' reactions.
Betsy, thank you so much. And there's a lot of, there are some questions and chat. And so I know people are really engaged and interested and have further thoughts and questions about it. So that's great. So now I will introduce our panelists who will react. So first we have Dr. Clantha McCurdy, who is the Senior Deputy Commissioner of Access and Student Financial Assistance at the Massachusetts Office of Student Financial Assistance. So Clantha will start. We also have Apalila Joseph, who is the Springfield Promise Administrator in the Springfield Public Schools. And we have Dr. Phil Bender, who is an educational leadership consultant who has worked in the field of education for many years. And he is going to share how his life has been significantly impacted by student and parent educational debt. So Clantha, I will start with you.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie, and good morning, everyone. I'm reminded of a Patriots commercial where one player, Devin McCurdy, is in the mirror and he's getting hyped up, and then the other player says, yeah, it's what Kevin or Devin said. So it's what Betsy said, but if you've seen that commercial, you know what I'm talking about. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the three areas that Betsy mentioned with some comments from my perspective as a staff member with the state agency. And first, I think we can all acknowledge that student loan debt is problematic. We can agree on that fact. Too often we have borrowers who are saddled with burdensome loan debt, and they leave school with an inability to make payments or and not graduate, or they graduate and then still find themselves having trouble making repayments. So in partnership, I think we should all see it as our role to educate students about educational loans, specifically about the amount that they need to continue to complete their education or their degree pursuits. And to that end, I believe that creative and responsible borrowing practices should be in place to help students and their families with decisions about debt and the long-term effect about borrowing. In Massachusetts, the Department of Higher Education has long advocated for lowering student borrowing. At one point, public college students seem to borrow less than their private college counterparts, but as students transfer from one institution to the other, we see the average loan debt increasing for public college students, though still somewhat lower than those who attend private institutions. And as we, the Department of Higher Education, look at bringing equity to the financial aid environment for low-income and racially minoritized students, we seek the elimination of unmet need before student loans are considered for direct costs. The goal is to eliminate need without the use of student loans. While this may require a huge investment by the Commonwealth, it is a start in the right direction. Programs implemented as part of the Department of Higher Education's equity agenda, such as the Mass Grant Plus, are purposed to help achieve this goal. Over the past 3 years, the Commonwealth has invested an additional $36 million at the community college and state university level to help eliminate unmet need for our low-income and Pell-eligible students. We look forward to analyzing the effectiveness of the Mass Grant Plus program in addressing unmet need and how that might relate to student debt. I think what I'm seeing is we are hoping that with the investment of additional money to help students with their direct costs, we may also see after 2-3 years, lower loan debt for students from certain income or EFC, soon to be SAI categories. So from a perspective, eliminating unmet need can be a factor in helping to reduce debt. I agree with Betsy on a number of the reasons that she listed as reasons that students borrow, but I cannot overlook the fact that annual loan limits also contribute to student debt, especially when you look at what's available to students, first-year students, second-year students, under both the subsidized and unsubsidized loan programs, not to mention plus loans that our parents are often encouraged to apply for. So I view affordability and accountability as factors in student debt. If states invest more resources for unmet need, then institutions should do their part. Institutions should not use state and, let's say, federal funds to supplant their own investment in the student's ability to afford the cost of attendance. But also controlling annual costs is a key factor, and our institutions must be held accountable by keeping costs down for students. Where would we be if students were encouraged to borrow only for unmet need for their direct bill charges? We seem to lack best practices in this area and often are not guiding students the right way. Rising costs, as I mentioned before, is a contributing factor, as well as award practices that our colleges often participate in addressing student costs or student need. Quite often we see campuses that have certain limits on the scholarship and grant aid that a student can receive, and then the rest is packaged in student loan. And I know of one of our prominent institutions that does that as a factor, to the point where if we have a Massachusetts scholarship that the student is eligible for, we are restricted to keeping that scholarship at a certain limit, which leaves the student to having to borrow loans. And I've not been able to convince the school, unless they change the policy this year, that this should not be the case. This is a zero EFC student population, and why not allow the state to meet a greater share of that unmet need rather than forcing that student to borrow more simply because of your policy with respect to holding students, all students, at a certain level with institutional, state, and federal grant support. Students and their families, especially low-income students and racially minoritized students, do not fully understand loan awards. Many of our families would just see the dollar sign to know that $30,000, $40,000, this is what my student is getting for college, and not understanding the difference, the additional money that needs to be there. So are we to feel good about some parents or some families who refuse to borrow because they do not want loans and they walk away from an opportunity for education? Or are we simply need to feel relieved that these students, as I said, will not attend college, or the fact that families will just take the debt so that their students would have an opportunity? There are many reasons, but that's a question that we need to think about. Are we in a better position when a family walks away or are we in a better position when families take on more debt? And I think there's a lack of information that leads to students over borrowing. But I think that until the right programs are put in place, I acknowledge that we do have a number of tools, but these tools have not led to reduced loan debt, right? So until we have the right combination of tools available for students and families, we will continue to see the student debt continue to rise. As far as repayment, let's acknowledge the fact, $1.5 trillion of outstanding federal loan debt is overwhelming. Currently, there are about 50 federal loan forgiveness and repayment programs authorized by the federal government, but about 30 of them are operational right now. So I think under the Higher Education Authorization Act, Congress has an opportunity to improve and simplify repayments for borrowers. So I see simplification and forgiveness as key. But just think about the complexity that we often encounter with all of these rules. I remember when I was employed by a national guarantor of loans, and as I visited colleges and universities, I had to think about when a loan was created and what the parameters were for repayment or interest rates and things like that, because you just had to keep it in perspective. If you got a loan that was created or a program that was created or an amendment to a regulation that was done 10 years before, 5 years or 2 years ago, if we have problems keeping up in our own profession, what about our students and families? I think repayment benefits are generous for students, but with, as I said, the multiple tweaks and changes over the years, it's just created a tangled web for options which are confusing to the student, and many are unable to take advantage of those benefits. So what can we do, or what can the Department of Education do? Well, the first thing I want to recognize is that as a public state agency, we are not able to tweak any of the federal regulations, but we can advocate, and we do advocate. There is a national organization of state student aid grant programs that has a voice at the table. And so we're always sharing the voice of our students and families and the institutions with respect to getting the federal government to modify changes in the rules that would benefit students, especially, as I mentioned, racially minoritized students. I'm reminded of the transition that Navient loans, students who had accounts with Navient are going through. Navient is a loan servicer, introduced the fact that they are getting out of the business and that those loans would be transferred to a servicer by the name of, I think it's Maximus or something like that. Only later, Navient sent a letter to their borrowers to say, your accounts are being transferred to AidVantage. Well, that's kind of confusing to students because they thought one thing and now they're being told another. In actuality, AidVantage is a subdivision or a sub-account for Maximum. So it's true, the loans are going where Navient first stated or what was first announced, but with that communication that came out, it suggested something else. So there's a lot of confusion there, but I think consolidating and simplifying federal loan repayment plans is something that would be most helpful. Should there be a single income-driven repayment program or a single consolidation? The other thing I think is that we could benefit from loan servicing agencies who are well-informed and who take the time to counsel students through their options. Don't offer a deferment to a student who actually needs a forbearance. Taking that extra time, making sure that students get the right information about their accounts and staying with them through that, I think would be helpful. So there's a lot of work that we need to do there. As far as loan forgiveness, wouldn't it be great if we could forgive all loans and start over? I would like that. Wouldn't it be great, as Betsy mentioned, if the Fed started to reinvest with state government to supplement some of the resources for financial aid. There was a program that we participated in years ago that's been discontinued, and it was called the State Student Incentive Grant Program. That program permitted states, or gave states, an incentive to continue to increase their state support for financial aid, because the more you committed, the more you got from the feds. If we could bring that program back, that would be wonderful. But I think, as I think about loan forgiveness, some of the other things that we don't think about so often is when loans are forgiven, I think the person that benefits from that has to use that forgiveness amount as income when they file for taxes the following year, or the year in which that was given. I don't know if many people are aware of that, but that is the case. Similar to any other debt that you might get forgiven from some other creditor or whatever, they send you a 1099, and you have to report that as income. So I think that there's much that can be done for loan forgiveness. I'm happy to see that our current administration, President Biden's administration, is devoting more time and attention to forgiveness. But in my perfect world, if you work for a company that is considered eligible for loan forgiveness, if you work a year, you get that credit toward your loan. You should not have to wait 5-10 years to get that credit. So give as you go. And I think that that would do a lot to keep people in that public service sector. Overall, I think loan availability for college is a good thing. It is needed, but it is high time that we overhaul the entire system. Thanks.
Thank you, Clantha. Okay, Apalila, I'm going to turn to you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Apalila Joseph. I'm the Springfield Promise Administrator for Springfield Public Schools. Essentially, what I do is I oversee our district's college financial aid advising program. So we're supporting seniors and their families through this full college financial aid process. And I will say my job exists because all of this is not easy. And that's in part like why we're here today talking about borrowing, repayment, and ultimately loan forgiveness. Betsy, thank you, because you hit on and highlighted so much of what I see in my day-to-day job. I can't tell you how many students and parents I've met with. And for many of our students, their senior year of high school is the first time where they're actually learning how much money their parents make. I will tell you right now, I have a 10-year-old and my son thinks that we are rich because he needs money to buy, V-Bucks for Fortnite, Roblox, he tells his friends, my mom is rich. He'll find out, I'm sure, before his senior year of high school that mommy is not rich. But for many of my students, as they're working with their parents through the FAFSA, through the CSS profile, they're realizing, oh my goodness, I didn't know my mom made that much money. And even what's even more true is many of our students don't understand how much mom has to stretch her annual salary to support the entire family. And so this is something that's very true of our students as they go throughout the college financial aid process. One thing that I think is so true and critical, like many of our students are going to be, dead set, as Betsy said, on that dream school. But I also think our social climate within the country also plays a role in the colleges that our students are choosing to attend. I'll say what's very true for my students is, the social climate just within the past 2 years, everything that we've seen from protests to racial incidents on campuses, both at public colleges and private colleges, it's severely impacting where many of my students want to go, and even if they want to go to college. I'll tell you right now, as we're kind of moving through the college process this fall, due to incidents that have popped up on some of our Massachusetts state college campuses, many of our students, as they're meeting with these admissions counselors, those are the conversations that they're having. How is the college addressing this? Is this a school that I truly want to go to? And for many of my students, a state college could be the better financial option, but they're going to choose to go somewhere else and take on additional student loan debt because they feel that that'll be a better social fit for them, not only for the student, but for the family. And I have parents who are more than willing to take on that additional debt because they don't want their child to go through those social challenges on a specific campus. Clantha hit on so many things that my students are seeing as they're moving through the aid process, particularly with those financial aid packages. The cost of higher education is high, and there is insufficient financial aid to meet that cost. For many of my students, we have first generation low income minority students. And so when it comes to those financial aid packages and looking at colleges, there are a couple of things that I encourage my students to think about. First and foremost, and Betsy hit on this, is graduation and retention rates. For my students, it's not just what the graduation and retention rate is for the school, but what does it look like for minority students on that campus? Betsy threw out some facts around the number of students who are actually graduating, within 4 years, within 6 years. What does that look like for minority first generation students on that particular college campus? And I can tell you for many of those schools, those numbers are very different. And that should be a guiding and determining factor for students as they're looking to choose colleges. The financial aid packages. Not all financial aid packages are created equally, unfortunately, and this is something that we know and we see continuously. For our students who look to attend highly selective, full need colleges, many colleges are turning to no loans as well. And those are great options, but very few of our students are actually making it to those campuses. Our students are going elsewhere, and it's great. I attended Smith College, and we recently just announced that we're going no loans. And that's wonderful, and I applaud them for that, but that's one school. We have so many other students who are looking to go elsewhere. And so how can we support students as they're navigating these financial aid packages? As our parents are sitting and going through these different financial aid packages, and I was on a webinar a year ago, and they said senior year is like the emergency room. We're trying to do so much during our kids' senior year of high school, like we can't fit it in. We need to do a lot more preventative care before we get to this point. In Massachusetts, we have MyCap, and I absolutely love MyCap because we need to get students thinking about their college and career plans before they get to their senior year of high school. And that's going to ultimately help them as they're navigating those financial aid packages from colleges. And even sitting with Mark sometimes, we're talking about how do we get kids to think about when they're borrowing, not just for their first year of college, but let's say they're going on to pursue a master's degree or to become a doctor, and they're thinking about borrowing in terms of like their full career trajectory. If our students aren't thinking about their career choices before their senior year of high school, that's going to be something that's very challenging for our students to actually successfully be able to do. And that's why you have so many students who are changing majors, so early on in their college career and switching campuses because they haven't done the self-discovery that's needed to go into college with a solid plan and blueprint for their future. The financial aid packages, of course, are confusing and list out loans. And depending on the college, you have all different types of unmet need. And we have many parents who are willing to figure out a way to meet that need because that is their child's dream school, or that school is going to be the better social fit for their child. But how can we get parents involved in this process a lot sooner so that as students are going through their senior year, as they're looking at different colleges, as they're looking through those different financial aid packages, the student and the parent are both on the same page to say, this is the ultimate career goal. This is what we know we have to do. We have to get a bachelor's, we have to go and get a master's. Here's what we're thinking about for our full debt upon graduation, and here's what repayment will look like. And of course, and I am a huge supporter of school counselors. This is something that can't just be a school counselor's job, but we have to think about how we can get full school communities involved in this process as we're supporting students and parents as they're exploring post-secondary options. And this really should be a K-12 approach and not just something that, again, we're doing during our students' senior year of high school. In terms of repayment, this is something that my students, like seniors in high school, they're not thinking about this. They're thinking about what do I need just to get to my first year and get me on the college campus. They're not thinking about what repayment is going to look like for them. For many of our students, they'll borrow, they'll stop going to school, they'll owe money, they can't get their transcripts, and then they're caught in a trap. And it's a continuous cycle. Or they'll go to a for-profit college, not finish there, and try to go to a community college. And again, they're caught in a trap. So how can we support our students in making better decisions up front so that they're not caught in this trap and they're racking up student debt that way? And Betsy hit on entrance counseling. My kids don't even really pay attention to it, if I'm being very honest. It's another step that they have to do just to fulfill whatever requirements, so that way they can enroll in college and get their financial aid situated. So how can we move these things so that they're more meaningful for our students and they're actually learning by doing them, and it's not another thing that they just have to check off and complete in order to enroll in the school. And I will say for our students, what we see is in order for them to attend a four-year school, they have to take out loans. There's no way around that. And for many of my students, they're like, yes, it's just like the natural next step, and not putting too much thought into the overall future and what repayment will look like for them. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the different repayment options and what forgiveness might look like depending on their career field. So students can then plan like, great, I know I want to be a teacher. I know there's a forgiveness program out there that I can take advantage of. And so how can we do some of this forward thinking with our students ahead of time, so that way they're going into college and ultimately their career field with a solid plan under their feet. And I'm just going to underscore once again, MyCap is a great part of that. And the more time we can have in our students' day, whether it be through a college and career class, an advisory, a crew block, to have the time to not only school counselors, but teachers working alongside school counselors to help make this a full school approach. So that way we're preparing our students for their future. So that way they're not saddled down with debt, and they can, start a career, start a family, buy a house, become active members in their society, and not be caught in this trap of continuous student debt. So I certainly would like to see colleges increase the financial aid that they're giving students. That does not include loans. I would like to see colleges revisit their displacement policies, because I have students who will work their tails off to apply for outside scholarships to help with their unmet need. And then we have colleges taking away aid that they've awarded students and replacing it with the scholarships that the students have been working towards. So I think the entire system certainly needs an overhaul at this point. But I would like to see, as the cost of education continues to go up, I would like to see the free resources available for students to also increase at this time, to take away from some of that student borrowing and parent borrowing that we're continuing to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Epalila. And it's so helpful to hear from, you sharing your students' experience. So thank you very much. And Dr. Phil Bender, you also have a very personal story to share.
I certainly do, Julie, and thank you all very much for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful program this morning. Just briefly give you an idea about my background. I spent 42 years in P16 education, 22 of those years as an elementary, middle, and high school teacher, and 20 years as an administrator, be it principal, assistant superintendent, and superintendent in a variety of different areas, parts in Indiana and where I retired at in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And during that time as an administrator, I did work closely with high school counselors, especially when it came to college admissions, always encouraging students and families to look for any types of avenues of funding that they could get prior to going to accept any type of a federal student loan. And as I look back on my own issues. I wish that I had taken a lot of the information I shared with those counselors to heart for myself. As a father of 3 daughters and being in education, I, as a parent, wanted the best for my children. So my oldest began her collegiate career, her first year. We were in a position where we had finances available to pay for her first year completely. And we were very pleased that we could do that. Number 2 year comes along, and all of a sudden, there are 2 girls from the Bender family that are off to college. And this created a little different situation. So I went to the first school, to the financial area, and I pleaded, what other types of programs are there available? What other types of grants? Because we've all been told over the years, there are all types of grants that go unfunded year after year that could be used for students going to college. And the first word out of the college counselor's mouth was, I suggest you look at the Parent Plus loan. That was the first word and the last word out of his mouth. So not only did I have to finance my second year of my oldest daughter's college, but now I'm looking at my middle daughter, because I have 3, and trying to find out a way to finance her way through school. And so I proceed to look at the Parent Plus loan. Now, obviously, having worked in loans at the high school level with counselors, and even as myself, when I finished my Ph.D., I was no new person to the loan process. However, when I went to the Parent Plus loan site, it was incredibly easy to get my daughters qualified for a year of school. It was amazing how simplistic it was to do that. And, you know, being a father of 3 daughters, 2 going off to college at this point in time, I thought, okay, this is kind of doable. You know, we'll play this year by year and see what we can do. Well, 2 years later, daughter number 3 comes along. And so here we are with the oldest in her senior year, thank heavens, the middle one sophomore, our junior, and then the youngest. Now, the youngest was a little bit more frugal in the sense that she chose a different university to go to that was less expensive. And she did put out a lot more effort as far as, you know, finding work, finding grants, those kinds of things. And so she did help out quite a bit, but still there was a need for the Parent Plus loan. And, you know, as a father who has helped out the first 2, it was logical that I go on ahead and provide that support for my 3rd daughter. And while her responsibility on the Parent Plus loan is considerably smaller than the other 2, when the youngest one finally graduated, which all 3 did graduate with undergraduate degrees, when she finally finished up, I was sitting on over $300,000 worth of Parent Plus loans. And the reality started to sink in because the oldest one was going off to grad school, which she was financing on her own, which gave me a deferment with her portion of that loan. And then as it was getting time for the second one, then she went off to grad school. So to make a long story short, all 3 daughters are now in grad school, with the oldest one having just finished with a degree in speech pathology. And the second one will finish her graduate degree in a year in clinical mental health, which is an area that's badly needed in this country. And the third one is working on her MBA. So I've been very blessed in the sense that I have, you know, daughters who have really excelled at their collegiate levels, and I couldn't be any more proud. Their mother and I couldn't be any more proud of what they've done. So here we sit today on this now $314,000 Parent Plus loan with the average interest rate at 7%. And I think that's interesting to know when we're sitting on an interest loan of 7% compared to loans that are being currently circulated in the housing industry. If we look at the amount of money that banks pay on interest rates, the amount of interest having to be paid on this loan is absolutely astronomical. And that's one of the biggest things that the country needs to look at in taking a look at loans is there's no need for excessive high interest rates on these loans. You know, make these loans in a position where they're more affordable to everyone to be able to pay those back. At this point in time, I have not done anything with these loans because of the COVID situation, but I know I'm going to have to make some drastic decisions come January, February, as far as what we do. Obviously, consolidation will be one of those, but once I enter consolidation, now I'm going to go back into a repayment plan. So as long as I don't have to do anything, I'm kind of sitting tight with where we are. So I didn't want to share a whole lot with you other than the fact that from a parent's point of view, it is incredibly easy to find yourself whipped up, so to speak, in these types of loans, especially a Parent Plus loan. If any of you out there are parents and you have gone the Parent Plus loan route, you understand, along with myself, how incredibly easy it is to get not just the loan, I mean the whole package. And that was where I fell short of not staying on top of it, because I was offered the max. And that's for housing, that's for schooling, the max that university offered. And it was incredible. It was incredible. So, you know, there's a million things that we need to do to correct the system. One of those being, you know, the situation that I'm in. I'm one of those 65 plus borrowers that Betsy alluded to earlier that are now in a position, you know, right now I do part-time work at a university and I'm putting that money back to hopefully, you know, begin paying these loans off. Will I pay these loans off in my lifetime? More than likely not. I hope that I can, but more than likely not. So it's a situation as my generation of borrowers move into retirement with this excessive debt on our shoulders and trying to figure out what to do next. It raises a whole multitude of questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that personal story that we know that there are many of them out there. We have a few questions. I will just share that it's 10:24, but we will stay on a bit past 10:30 if people want to stay on, just so we get some of your questions answered. So I think I'm going to go to this question first, because I think you all talked about this and about the communication and having borrowers understand what they're doing, having students understand. So someone asks, are there any financial aid literacy programs, resources, and websites that you'll suggest for people to use to create presentations and inform their clients, students, parents earlier? So would anyone like to take that?
I mean, studentaid.gov is a good, you know, sort of low hanging fruit that has information, everything from filling out the FAFSA to what to do if you are in default. So that's a good start, but I'm sure, you know, there's other nonprofits out there that have a lot of information on their websites especially about applying for aid. Mapping Your Future comes to mind. I'm sure the rest of my panelists might have some other, or you too, Julie, might have some suggestions.
I was just going to add both MEFA and Mass Edco have great resources. that I've used with my families, especially as you're like looking at those financial aid offers and trying to think about like overall student loan debt and borrowing.
I might also add to Betsy's organization that she heads up is actually how I ended up here today. I found her a little over a year ago, and basically she was very wonderful in just answering questions, that I had. And I think what that says is that we need more of that nationwide, where borrowers have a source that they can go to and just email a question and try to get some kind of a response that certainly makes sense. And she's been a tremendous help for me. Just she's lent her ear to me to be able to, discuss situations and how to work through things. And unfortunately, we need thousands more people in this country to be able to do this, to provide that help that people so desperately need.
Yes. And this is another question about a resource too. And where can the average family find the year-to-year retention rates, average debt rates, default rate, et cetera, for a given school?
So I can put it up in the chat panel, but I would recommend the College Scorecard and the College Navigator. The College Scorecard is a little more consumer friendly, but the College Navigator has more data.
That's great. And I will add that MEFA has an upcoming webinar that is about looking at that data when making college decisions. And that is coming up in November. So I'll add that as well.
And Julie, the Department of Higher Education tracks a lot of demographic and enrollment data for the public colleges. So at mass.edu, someone could go there and just look at research data, put in a search word, and it'll bring you to our data center. So there's quite a bit of information there as well.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. And someone asked if we could put the list of Fed, non-Fed forgiveness opportunities in the chat.
I would say, so if we did put a link, I saw that a link was put up for my website, which is freestudentloanadvice.org. If you click on forgiveness, it'll bring you to that database that has all those forgiveness programs.
Excellent, thank you. And this might be for you, Betsy, but others as well. Do you have any data on how many of those in default, currently in default, may qualify for the total and permanent disability forgiveness?
No. And I don't think that data is, out there in any type of report.
Yep. And so then there is a question, Dr. Bender mentioned maybe not being able to pay off these loans in his lifetime. So someone asked, how does it get paid back, or what happens there?
Federal student loans are discharged upon the death of the borrower. And in the case of a Parent Plus loan, also upon, God forbid, on the death of the dependent student for whom the loan was taken. They are not billed to the estate. Private loans, on the other hand, it varies. It used to be uncommon for a private loan to be discharged upon the death of the borrower or the cosigner. It's becoming more common, but it varies by private loan product.
Thank you. I have one more, and feel free to type in additional questions. Considering there is little chance of broad loan forgiveness, is there any chance of advocacy happening to push the federal consolidation options that include lowering the interest rates, as was done in the past, late 90s, early 2000s?
Whoever asked that question, I'm so glad you did. I actually do think, my personal opinion is, I think that we might have a better chance of getting Congress to retroactively lower interest rates on existing loans than we do have on broad student loan forgiveness. But the way to do that is to write your members of Congress. So I think the student loan advocates out there now are just still really focused on the broad student loan the broad student loan forgiveness proposal. Excuse me. But I think all of us should be writing our members of Congress and educating them. I mean, I hear it from borrowers all the time that say, you know what, I want to pay my loans back, but I don't feel like I'm on an even playing field because of the interest rates. And I think we heard that from Dr. Bender as well. So yeah, write your members of Congress, all of you.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Julie, I was just going to jump in for a second because first I want to thank everybody for their comments, and I appreciated Apalila's shout out about what I consider to be a dog on a bone when it comes to borrowing. You know, we work with about 12,000 youth and adults every year, as I mentioned earlier, and we sort of have a rule of thumb that I think is helpful for school counselors and those advising students on how much to borrow. Our rule of thumb is, and it's just a guideline, is to take a look at your potential income when all of your education is done. And to say that you can afford about 10% of your monthly income on a student loan without sacrificing your financial future. So the example that I give is that if you project that your initial income is going to be $45,000, your take-home pay could be about $2,800. So you can afford about a $280 a month loan payment without sacrificing your financial future. That equates to borrowing about $26,000 over 10 years. When you're armed with that information as a high school junior or senior, you then start your search process and you look at the affordability issue, you know, of whether this school looks like it's going to be not just a good academic career fit, but as well as a financial fit. To Apalila's point, though, we always say you can't just look at your undergraduate education. You have to look at your total educational pathway and the costs associated with it. So this is where, you know, we hear students who have gone to grad school and, you know, and will admit, I never realized I was going to have to borrow so much. So if we can get high school seniors and even our adult clients with Mass Edco's EOCs, if we can get them to think in terms of the total process of borrowing, not just for undergrad, because all too often people want to exhaust all of their borrowing capacity at the undergraduate level. So 10% becomes just sort of a way of school counselors and ed advisors to have that initial conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I think the more you know, facts, tidbits that we have that stick, right? That stick for different groups of students, different ages, all of that, more helpful. So I don't see any more questions, but this has been you know, a great engaged group. There are a lot of thank yous here, so I give a thank you to all of our panelists and to Betsy for all of that important information. And if there's, I don't know if there's anything else that anyone would like to share.
Alice and I, and this is Alice who has poked her tail up. If I know there's probably a million questions about the PSLF waivers, I suggest that you either sign up for the CFPB webinar. I posted the link in the chat, or if you go to our website, I posted a link specifically to our PSLF page. All the details are there, and there's also an FAQ document. So that's a great place to start for information about those waivers.
Thank you so much. All right, well, thank you all. Thank you to everyone, and have a good day and good luck with all.